Hello, welcome to the ZX Spectrum. Today we're joined by Dr. Jenny Rice, Associate Professor of Writing, Rhetoric and Digital Studies at the University of Kentucky, to explore what we would call conspiracy theories, so a belief that some covert but influential organisation is responsible for an unexplained event, and I totally got that from Wiki. There are plenty to choose from. You might have heard of some of them. There was Sandy Hook. There's the QAnon, which in the last couple of years has just exploded into kind of like a lot of people's consciousness. The moon landings is one, even COVID-19. These are seen by some as elaborate hoaxes. Now, Jenny is an expert in what I think you described, Jenny, as conspiracy narratives. Is that correct? So we'll dig a little bit more of that into the podcast. I'll give a little bit more background to Jenny. She's written a book called Awful Archives, Conspiracy Theory, Rhetoric and Acts of Evidence, that looks at topics particularly around the role of evidence or bad evidence, as you explain it, and how it plays out in the fringes of public discourse. So this is pseudo-science, the paranormal, conspiracy theories about 9/11, moon landing, UFO sightings, things like that. These are all topics of conspiracy theories that millions across the world believe in. And it's absolutely fascinating. And I think it's really pertinent that we kind of like cover this subject at the moment. So welcome, Jenny.
Thank you so much for having me.
How are you?
I'm great.
You're joined by your dog today, I believe.
Yes, he's here as always, right beside me. So hopefully he will stay out of the shot. But as always,
we've got a cats and a dog here, so
yeah. And I'm just on the one dog. I don't think I can deal with anymore. But yeah, well, it's lovely to meet you. I guess the first question that really makes sense to start with is, what is a conspiracy theory, or as you like to quote it, a conspiracy narrative?
So, I mean, there's a few different ways to approach it. I mean, if we think about what a conspiracy theory is, just as a descriptive term, a conspiracy is just defined as where two or more people conspire to do something hidden. So I have two kids, so if they were to, say, conspire amongst themselves to sneak out of bed while I'm sleeping to, go downstairs and steal cookies, that would technically be a conspiracy. And then, so conspiracy theory on its own is sort of a neutral term, right? It's a theory about, some event that involves, obviously a conspiracy. But obviously the way that we tend to use it has that kind of pejorative, negative tone, right? We tend to think about conspiracy theorists as people who aren't kind of legitimately theorizing about something that actually happened, but have sort of adopted these narratives that, buck against not only like what we would consider to be established fact or widely agreed upon facts, but, are sort of, fringe. And so I use the term conspiracy narrative because I think it, at least for me, describes, what it is we're really talking about, which is people who come up with these alternative narratives to what most of us would consider to be factual or, settled matters, and have created alternative stories shared amongst themselves. Mm-hmm. So when I say, conspiracy theory or conspiracy narrative, I'm just trying to point to the fact that, technically conspiracy theories, just as a descriptive, don't have that pejorative, but we tend to use it as such.
Mm-hmm. So with that in mind, is it normal for these to be around? Is this part of human nature? What's the earliest kind of like description of a conspiracy theory as we would understand? Where do they originate from?
That's a really good question. I mean, they definitely are not new. Conspiracy narratives of this way have been around for a very long time. So we could look at something like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion has been around for, centuries. And, this originates out of Russia and, and around Europe, and then, comes to United States. And so this is a document where, people supposedly it's, it's of course a forgery. It's not it's not true, but it was imagined to be this document where a secret cabal of Jews met in order to plot the overtaking of the world. And, that still gets shared, but it's been around for a very, very long time. And so I think that, in some way, if we think about what conspiracy narratives do, is to kind of look for other explanations for problems or issues, so people, why is it that the protocols took hold? Well, especially after World War I, you have people whose lives are turned upside down, right? Or people who are in incredible poverty. And so they're looking for some explanation, like, why are these bad things happening? And so what conspiracy narratives do is they attribute agency to some other group or actors or some other reason. There's a reason. And so, I think that anytime that we have bad things that happen to us, or we wonder, like, why would something like this happen? If you can attribute it to something coherent, even if it's something terrible, like this group is secretly plotting, it at least gives a sense of coherence to the world, right? And it makes it not your fault. It takes agency away. So I think for, just on that alone, I think that that's maybe, we could say that it's kind of natural to humans, right? We don't like to think that things are either our own fault, our own making, but we also don't like, we don't like having mysteries. We don't like having bad things that happen without explanation.
So if you look at it in that way, is this because a lot of people would put some things down to the will of God, or, religion and faith,
right,
part in how we construct or make sense of the world. And for some people, does conspiracy theory fill, this is possibly the worst term, but does it fill a gap? Does it fill a space? Whereas potentially where that might have been filled by a faith or a religion, it's now filled by these it's now filled by these narratives that it's easier to believe that than perhaps believe the facts that you're shown.
I think that's a really good, I do tend to think of it as, some of the conspiracy narratives we hear almost have that kind of magical thinking involved. And they're sometimes so fantastic, like the QAnon stuff that's going around now is in some ways just so completely fantastic. That, it in the same way that you would attribute, something, an earthquake, to the will of God, it does, as you said, fill a gap. There's some explanation behind it. And, there, even if to those of us who think this sounds loony, this sounds crazy, there is a logic to it, even if it's one that most of us would say it's not a very good logic or a sound logic, but there is a logic to it, that you find some explanation, whether it's God or, some deity, or this secret, shady, underground group of, conspirators. There is at least something you can identify and say, aha, that's why this is happening.
So just really quickly, sorry, Brandon, you can jump in a moment, but just really quickly, can you explain what QAnon is to some people who might not quite understand?
It's not quite as a big thing, I would say, in this country as it's been in the States.
But it's gaining.
It's gaining momentum.
Same in particularly, that.
I find that really fascinating. That was a question that I had for you guys, your experience with QAnon. So QAnon is really interesting, and I will kind of go back and I'll give you like the briefest version of a really complicated history. There was in the 80s, in the 1980s, we experienced, and I think this is the case also in Britain too, we experienced the satanic panic, right, where people were suddenly, where suddenly people are, coming up with these fantastic stories of, underground cults and, in high places. And, so there was a lot of that kind of happened, and, it died out, mid 90s, late 90s. But, that element still is very much, I think, with us present, this idea that not only are there evil forces in the world, but there are sort of secret groups. And even before that, we've had fears of Illuminati and, Freemasons. And so we have kind of a long history. I think in both countries, you have a long history of fear around these sort of secret, shady, quasi-evil groups, bordering on like Satanist. So during the when we were watching Hillary Clinton, her election, so we kind of catch up, there was on WikiLeaks, there was a dump of a whole bunch of emails that came out with people working with her. And, I've combed through these emails. They're very sort of benign emails. But online, for some reason, there were people who were, had this sort of mindset already that there's secret groups. And they combed through these emails, finding these repeated references across various emails to pizza of various kinds. So some of them are like, hey, do you want to get a pizza tonight? So between Podesta, who's working with Hillary Clinton, and his brother. And then there was, these fundraisers at a very popular, hip, pizza place in DC called Comet Pizza. And somehow there's a group online who came up with this idea that these were all coded messages, and they're actually referring to an underground ring of satanic pedophiles. So again, sounds fantastic and out there, but it took hold, right? And so once you begin to, if you're already of the mindset that all messages are coded, then you're going to find them everywhere, right? So nothing is what it seems. And so this became what was known as Pizzagate. And, it seemed to come out of the blue, but it took hold and people were very, very serious about it. One man was actually drove hundreds of miles from his home and showed up at this Comet Pizza armed, planning to rescue these children being held underneath this pizza place by satanic pedophiles working with the Democratic Party. So we have that was sort of a precursor to QAnon. So then during the 2016 election, already we were in, I can't quite stress the strangeness of the last 4 years, 2016, with Donald Trump. This was, a lot of us are still sort of trying to figure out what just happened. The rise of Donald Trump was not a typical candidate for us. This was not a typical moment. Everything seemed a little bit off balance. And it was around this time that on a website called 8chan, which was, much like 4chan, where a lot of people go to do these kinds of, conspiracy thinking, floating these ideas. There was somebody who called himself Q, and he said, I'm working with the deep state. There's this thing called the deep state, right? That there's the people running things are, there's shadowy figures are hidden. And Donald Trump is actually this person who's going to come in and expose all of this. So it was already very bizarre. When all of this started happening, a lot of us were like, what? Where is this coming from? But it took hold. And I think, QAnon is for me sort of a mixture of so many confusing things. Sometimes you'll see people have charts trying to figure it out. I think it came about in a specific moment with Trump and the weirdness surrounding the kind of alt-right that was enabled by Trump's own rhetoric. It's strange. The thing that's interesting to me about QAnon, even still, and the people who got involved in it, is that it's sort of a grand narrative. It's like a conspiracy of conspiracies. It kind of encapsulates everything. And, there are now people talking about the fact that it is almost cult-like, and people talk about leaving QAnon almost in the same way that they would talk about leaving cults, or they'll talk about family members. So what we're seeing with QAnon is a little bit different from, say, the JFK or moon landing conspiracy theories, or even 9/11, because it sucks in sort of everything. Everything seems to be able to be sucked up into it. And it's, it has grown, I think, because it doesn't have a central focus. I think it started out with this idea that Donald Trump was somehow going to come in, but it's able to grow. So when I saw this article seeing like there's QAnon stuff popping up in Europe and in Great Britain, I thought, how? To me, this was a distinctly American conspiracy.
I think for me, looking at, I think Lizzie and I, it's fair to say we probably sit on the other end of the sort of spectrum in terms of our focus on science and things like that. But I think the reason that it might be able to take hold in this country, at least, is there's a particularly large disenfranchised group in the UK that made their voice heard, in particular during the Brexit campaign and such. And now that is kind of all over and said and done. I wonder if the link is forming into those people needing to find essentially a new place and a new sort of group to adhere to. Because from my understanding, from what I've seen from QAnon, from this side of the ocean, is very much, it feels like it is encapsulated and become people's identity. Bigger than, I feel like I've heard, in my lifetime, people say, that Bush did 9/11, or the moon landing was fake. I feel like you see those come around from time to time, but people don't necessarily, it doesn't change people's lives. I think the QAnon one seems to have fundamentally shifted things. And I mean, the events that happened on Capitol Hill in America, you don't see people necessarily taking to the streets in the same way when when they had conspiracies about the moon landing, for example.
And so what's interesting about QAnon is that the delivery that Trump was supposed to bring never came.
Right.
It's like, what happens then when they are exposed? They just change the narrative.
This is so, there's two things that I was going to say. One is, the idea of, I think QAnon is a very extreme example of sort of the way people get caught up with identities. But at a certain level, conspiracy theorists, or people who, sort of abide by it, it does allow for them to create narratives that give them a certain identity. So even if they say we're being controlled by this shadowy group, it makes them sort of on the inside, right? Even if they're being controlled, at least I know, right? I have the truth. And so you find people, it does provide a certain identity, even if it's somebody who is on the inside. I have this information, I'm awake, I am not asleep. And so you see this type of identity. I think QAnon is an extreme example of that, which is why a lot of people sort of compare it more to a cult than, to what we've typically seen with conspiracy theories, which can you can get very wrapped up in it, but not quite to the extent that we're seeing here. But as something you just said reminds me, like what allows conspiracy theories to persist and what makes them sustainable is that they have what often gets called a self-sealing quality. So meaning, like, you could present evidence. Is why arguing or debating a conspiracy theorist is never going to work, because you could present evidence to them, right? You could say, well, these things that you believe, look, factually, I can show you. But you already become suspicious, right? So on the 9/11, for example, we have the 9/11 Truth Commission and these reports that said, here's exactly what happened. There's a journal called Popular Mechanics who had this special issue and then a book that went, it's engineers and scientists who said, like, okay, let's actually look at each of these claims by 9/11 truthers. Here's why these don't hold up just on basic scientific level. But then they become suspicious, right? Well, of course you would say that, because that makes you part of it. And the fact that you are now giving us this information shows that we are on the right track, because you're trying so hard to disprove us. We must be right. So it gets absorbed into the narrative and almost like empowers, right? The fact that you are showing me this evidence means that you are really trying hard to get me to go, to shut up and to go off track. So it does have this sort of, like, there's one of the things that psychologically that happens in a conspiracy theory is that the power of cognitive dissonance and the power of cognitive dissonance reduction is what's so powerful. So if if I believe something and then you show me something that proves factually I was wrong about this, there's cognitive dissonance starts, and and our brains cannot handle cognitive dissonance, right? So either I have to admit I was wrong about that, or you have to be wrong about that. And so what often happens is that you are not only wrong, but now I'm even more right than I was before. It often, there's a political scientist who studies a lot of this named Brendan Nyhan, and he describes what's called the backfire effect, which often happens when conspiracy theorists are presented with factual information. It doesn't weaken their belief, it actually can strengthen their belief. Mm-hmm. I know that I'm right now.
Yeah, sort of that double down of like, obviously I'm not wrong, this is the belief. Yeah, I think we've seen, maybe not quite to the extent of QAnon in that, but I think in the UK at least, there's definitely been examples of that. I don't know if you'd agree, Lizzie, where the truth gets lost, and then more examples of the truth come out, and then essentially they get dismissed because they don't support the same narrative, and then people double down and they believe that narrative even more.
Yeah, I think we've seen it with some of the anti-vaxxers most recently, because there is quite I wouldn't, it's not a not everybody's an anti-vaxxer, but there is a significant, I think, vocal minority who are anti-vaxxers, and but don't believe that there's there is even a virus, or that this no pandemic. It's all I have a neighbor who I just bumped into, had a chat with them the other day, and they were like, "You're going to get vaccinated?" I was like, "Yeah, of course I'll get vaccinated." He's like, "I'm not." He said it's just all a lie. And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "It's pharma, media." He said, it's all of them. It's just, I'm not having it. He said, "Do you know anyone who's died from it?" That was his question. Do you know anyone who's died from it? And it was really like, I was quite taken aback, because I didn't expect it from this person, because I kind of, I know them, and I had nothing to say back. I just was like, well, I'm having my vaccine, and that was it. I didn't even want to engage in that conversation, and that really shocked me, actually, because I don't occupy social media that much. I don't go on Facebook. I don't, for many reasons. One of the reasons is so much on there is such nonsense. I just don't want to be around it. But then, and this is a question that I was going to ask, you're suddenly faced with these things in real world and in real life. And I think one of my questions is, how did we move from the, these edges, these fringes, into mainstream? When did that happen? And not just with the anti-vaxxers, with lots of different ones. There seems to be, and maybe I'm wrong, but it feels like it's moving more into, I wouldn't say mainstream as in press, but mainstream consciousness, or the anti-vaxxers, this
Yeah.
this questioning. How's that happen?
I do think, there's a lot of debate. It does seem, it can often seem like suddenly there are conspiracy theories everywhere, like they've grown. I would say I don't know necessarily that there's more today, but having said that, if you think about, if you were, say, a moon landing conspiracy theorist in 1975, you are somebody who may read a lot of these things. You may have some friends close to you, or coworkers or something, family members who you talk about these things to, and you may be challenged on it, right? You push back. You may have some people who agree, but you're going to encounter people. You have to put yourself on the line. You actually have to sit down, and I have to say to you, Lizzie, I'll be honest, I don't think that there was a moon landing. You're going to say, what are you talking? But with social media, you have none of that risk. There's no personal risk to me having you look at me like I'm crazy, right? I can be very self-selective about the people I talk to. I can talk to other people who won't challenge me on that. In fact, will sort of say, you are right. And in fact, here's all this other stuff. Suddenly I have a community. I can talk to those people. There is no risk to me. I'm anonymous. I can go online. And so I think having that sort of social media sense of, ideally, there's an ideal of public discourse, right? Where we go face to face and we talk through things, and you in some ways are risking yourself, right? You're allowing yourself to be challenged. You have to answer back. But if we don't have any of that risk, I'm anonymous, we see how people behave when they know that they're completely anonymous, say terrible things that they wouldn't say otherwise if they were face to face, right? Or if their name was out there. And so I think there's a kind of safety net there that allows people to congregate and talk and to not experience what I find ideal, which is like to be exposed to, debate, hearing other people's ideas, to having to actually think through these ideas out loud, with each other. And so I think this is one way that I think conspiracy theories, if they haven't grown, they've at least become, they've changed because you can now find a community very, very easily in ways that you couldn't have prior to social media.
Would you say nowadays, more than anything, and I think maybe QAnon is the example of all of this kind of coming together essentially, is it much easier now to bring, if you're particularly susceptible to believing a certain conspiracy theory, is it more likely then you'll be able to hook on and believe more and more and more? Because that's kind of what I see QAnon as, is kind of this perpetuating cycle where when one theory shuts down, the next one springs up, and that group of people are particularly susceptible to that, and that group grows and grows and grows.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of really good studies done on this, quite a lot, that show that people who, if you believe a conspiracy theory, you're more likely to believe in others. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it could be the case that somebody just says, I don't believe in conspiracy theories, but I don't think that, I think that the fluoride in our water is poisoned, or is mind controlling us. I mean, it's much more likely. So people, a lot of work in psychology is focused on, what is it that makes people more susceptible? And the interesting thing that is shown again and again, that it's not the case that, people who believe in conspiracy theories have, certain education levels or certain political, it's all over the spectrum. We've seen again and again. It can seem right now very much like, and this is the conversation that we have here, that it seems very much like this is all on the right. And there's, good reason for that. I think QAnon is an example of, it seems very much like it is right-wing affiliated. However, at least, from what we're seeing, it's largely people who have kind of had conspiratorial predispositions before and have not had any political identification. In fact, have not, don't identify as Republicans or Democrats don't have, in fact, they feel on the outside. They're people who largely haven't voted, haven't been, involved. Again, which is why I think Donald Trump not being a politician sort of spoke to this, like it's not a political figure. This is somebody who is on the outside, like they feel on the outside. QAnon for many, the Republican Party right now is just in the state of complete shock, because suddenly all of these people who they don't recognize as being part of them are suddenly here seeking to disrupt it, and they don't have the ideology is not political. No. It's something quite different.
That's something that I found really telling with Donald Trump's campaign and things like that, and was that there didn't actually feel like there was much substance to his campaign. He wasn't really campaigning for anything. He didn't necessarily have core objectives as the Biden camp did, to get the stimulus check through and work towards climate change and things like that. It was very much at least from an external perspective over here, it felt like it was kind of more about him more than anything. I don't know if there's I appreciate that it's across the political spectrum in ways, but I think it was very much like you say, with the outsiders from around that, because the thing I found quite interesting when the storm on the Capitol happened is just how many different groups of people, from lawyers to policemen to very well educated people, and that did the same thing as anybody else. And I think it's really interesting to me how that will continue to play out, because but I feel like, if anything, although maybe it didn't get Donald Trump into the White House, I don't see it necessarily going away anytime soon, and they'll latch onto someone else.
No, that was one of the questions I was going to ask. I was going to say, as things become, there are some quite outlandish things. I mean, if you look at them and try to dismantle them, you can dismantle them. But do you think we'll ever live in a post-conspiracy world, or is it, is this something that we've got to learn to navigate ourselves? And my follow-up question is, how does that impact? This is a risk to democracy as well, as we're seeing.
I mean, I'm like a lot of us here who is still shaken from what happened on January 6th. Like, just shaken to the core. I think what we watched was just unimaginable, and we're still sort of thinking, like, what just happened here? And what's interesting to me is that what ended up, the events that actually played out made sense to me from what I know about conspiracy narratives, which is that there is no end cycle. In fact, the worst thing that could happen for conspiracy theorists is, like, they solve the case, it's done, they walk away, because it does, it is a rabbit hole, right? And it's endless, which also means, if you're caught up in this sort of endless cycle, it's almost like it's spinning for the sake of itself, right? You want to keep searching. So when this group of people, and it's largely, QAnon affiliated, storming the Capitol, they went in there and didn't have anything to do. I mean, they, wandered through things and, took pictures and made a mess, but there was no big plan. Like, they got in there and they thought, now what? Which to me is so interesting. It could have been terrible if they had all been armed. It could have been bloody. It could have been horrible. But they went in there with no objective, right? And I think that moment was like, it shows me that, at least for them, there's no, like, end cycle, and the fact that it's this sort of self-sealing quality. So a lot of us, and I'm among these people, who have said, because these do tend to become more intensified through social media, I do think it is important for the social media sites who before were taking a very hands-off approach to say no more. And after the insurrection, you know, Facebook and Twitter, YouTube started to finally say, okay, we will take this more seriously. I write about Alex Jones and his deplatforming. Alex Jones for years was, you know, contributed to a number of, you know, really heinous conspiracy theories that, you know, led to like ruining people's lives, especially regarding Sandy Hook. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it took finally one of the, you know, some of the parents whose children were killed in Sandy Hook to end up, you know, suing. And it became, so this is what ultimately led to his, you know, YouTube take him down, his you know, all these hosting services. And so whereas before the, you know, social media said, well, you know, it's a free speech issue, or it's, you know, we can't really regulate speech. I think finally the events of January 6th scared people enough to say, there's nothing we can do to intervene with this group of people. And so deplatforming them and not allowing this is one option that we have right now that we have to take seriously, because whereas before it might have just been annoying or a threat to democracy in some vague way, what we saw on January 6th was unlike anything else. And so I think it took that to finally convince these companies to take it seriously.
Do you think that sort of deplatforming will essentially will ride lots of people out? Is it kind of like, I don't know how the best way to describe it, but essentially, you know, if people are getting constant exposure to the conspiracy theories they believe in online, is a decrease in that exposure, does it eventually sort of get it out their system, so to speak? Is it something that becomes such to that point because they have constant exposure, and does removal of that exposure in the long run decline it, or do we not really know?
You know, one obvious problem with deplatforming, of course, is that it's going to have that backfire effect big time, where now people are like, I knew it. I knew we were being, you know, but I think there's something to be said for the fact that, like, even when in my research, it's ironic because I Google, you know, I work with a lot of white supremacists, also extreme rhetoric and conspiracy. So when I Google certain things, Google has its algorithm to where, you know, the most heinous websites don't pop up, which is ironically just a problem for me, and then for people who want to read that stuff for themselves. But, you know, it's not a perfect response. I think a better response for us, and I'm saying us very, very broadly in all kinds of ways, you know, for me, what the important thing to remember is that conspiracy theories, they do create a coherent, even if it's weird, a coherent narrative of the world, but internally they are not coherent or consistent. So one of my favorite studies was done a few years ago, I think actually with some British conspiracy, this is maybe in the 90s, who they were measuring their, you know, like on a spectrum, like, do you agree with this statement? Do you agree with this statement? And what they found was that it was all about, like, one of the conspiracies was Princess Di conspiracy.
That she was murdered.
That she was murdered. But then the people who agreed with the fact that, yes, there was this intentional murder, but then they also tended to agree with the fact that she's still alive somewhere. She's hidden. And, you know, this goes back, it's part of a study that was done even earlier. It's another version of a study that was done in the 1950s of Americans' anti-Semitic attitudes. And on that one, they found in much the same way, they agreed, people would say, yes, I think Jews tend to be, they're isolated and they don't, you know, they stick to themselves and they're not part of our community. But then they also agreed, they try to mingle and fit in with everybody, and they're just like us. And so you think in both of these cases, you think, well, it has to be one or the other, right? She's either dead or alive. I mean, or she, you know, it has to be one.
Well,
But what, in both cases, what they found was that it's not the consistency or the inconsistency. There's an underlying nuclear idea here. And maybe in one case, it's just, I don't like Jews, right? So that's sort of the underlying. So whatever sort of thing pops in, you know, they're just like us, or they're too isolated, or, you know, basically like I don't trust the government, and, you know, something happened. So whatever pops up, yes, she was murdered, or no, she's secretly still in hiding somewhere. There's a larger nuclear idea there. And I think it's important for us to think, so like in QAnon, what is behind this? So I think it's, you know, it begins by saying, like, what is it that's motivating people to pop in here to begin, you know, whatever sort of belief of the day that pops in and fits that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting as well, because, you know, lots of the QAnon stuff is around, you know, deep state and things like that. And then they look as like Donald Trump as the sort of righteous way out. But Donald Trump was the head of that quote unquote deep state and the government for 4 years. Yet that seems to almost have been kind of removed from the narrative. You know, for them to, because it doesn't fit the vision. If Donald Trump is there was this whole belief, wasn't there, that there was like a kind of that him winning the election was going to be a righteous sort of day out. But he was already the president, that nothing would have, you know, categorically changed except for more of the same. And I find that really, really kind of interesting how that plays out. And actually the mentioning of Princess Diana and things like that, I think I've heard that story a lot of times, even from my own family, of the conspiracy that the royal family.
Yeah, it was at the time, you know, I remember it vividly when it happened. And at the time, it was all around, oh, she was pregnant with Dodi's baby, and they could never have they could never have a Muslim child into the royal family. Therefore, you know, she was murdered. It was a really strong argument that some people put forward, and it was bizarre. It was very peculiar to have that kind of, and be part. And this is way before this is way before we had, you know, Facebook and social media, and yet these things, you know, you became aware of them.
You know, in some ways, I do think that the appeal of narratives like that happen, you know, the conspiracy theories aren't just always about like shadowy figures, but when we face things that are just tragedies that don't have an explanation. And so the example that I often use with students is Sandy Hook, which was just unimaginably painful. You know, you have somebody with incredibly, you know, mental illness problems. We have everybody here has access to all kinds of guns, but, you know, kills, you know, children. There's, you know, we could talk about like mental or abilities or inability to handle mental illness in this country, or access to guns, but at the end of the day, there's no explanation. And so the belief, as extreme as it is, that it never happened, that all of those kids are alive, nothing bad happened, this was all made up in order to, the funny thing, like 9/11, Sandy Hook, Boston bombing, the idea is like the government's trying to take our guns. Like the government's never going to take our guns. It's never once happened. Everybody's guns are still safe. Mm-hmm. But it's in some ways more comforting to believe that than to believe the alternative, which is just that sometimes these things happen.
This comes back to my original kind of like point of, you know, drawing it to faith and religion. You know, people have deep, you know, faith and understanding around, you know, or take comfort from their faith, and I get that, I understand that. But when the inexplicable happens, that's when we make these stories up, to make it more comfortable to us, to make it more, you know, appropriate for us.
Yeah.
And that's how we manage our grief, and that's how we manage our anger, and we put it to something else.
I think you really like have to kind of people like people to blame, and it's always, you know, they like to find answers for things. And I think sometimes in situations like that, yeah, we can point to mental health and things like that, but fundamentally there isn't really an answer for it. It's just a freak moment of human nature. And
there
I
are
don't know if,
many,
yeah, which there are many, but yeah.
So
but
I have one question today. How did you get into this? How did you actually, how did you become interested in conspiracy theories?
I didn't originally start off to do this. My background is in, I study rhetorical theory, and I'm very interested in public debate and public conversations around different things. So my first book was all about gentrification in Austin, Texas, where I did my PhD. And I'm just interested in how we talk to each other and how we debate certain issues. That's a big interest of mine. And so originally I was interested in how people who I was interested in how people collect research in order to sort of debate other people. And so I wasn't starting off by thinking of conspiracy theories, but I thought, oh, well, this will be a case study, an example of how people do their own research. And so I had only planned on doing this as like one case study. And so I ended up, there's a huge 9/11 truther community here. They have meetups, they have conferences, they have lots of groups. And so I found a lot of people who were more than willing to talk with me and interview. And so I started going to conferences. And the more I went, the more I was trying to figure out what is happening. How do people believe this? And I guess I had, sort of a fringe interest in conspiracy theory, like everybody does. I hadn't really thought much about it. I just thought these are wackos, right? And then realized like these aren't wackos, but I don't understand. I had so many questions about why it was so hard to debate with them, and also what was motivating them. And I wanted to understand more. So I did about 2 years of field work with 9/11 truthers and some primarily truthers, but then some other kinds. And so I ended up just writing my book about trying to better understand what's going on. But also the bigger question was like, how do you talk to them? How
that was going to be I think we've got to have to wrap this up soon, but
yeah, that was going to be my final question.
How do you, because like you, I don't think they're all crazies. They're not. This is what they passionately believe in, or even just a little bit believe in, and they're not unhinged. They're in their own thinking. They're rational. Yeah. So and I'm the irrational one. How do you have that conversation, or that space in which you can communicate around these things when faced with them?
Well, so even though I really appreciate you sort of making the analogy with religion and faith, because I think that usually my answer, I give a slightly different answer, but I would say it like this: like, could you imagine debating somebody out of their faith, right? That's not going to happen, right? I mean, this is something that people do change, but it comes from their own sort of internal happenings or something like that. And then there's good reason for that, because it's faith, right? It's not something that comes from a sort of reasoned place. And so to use the example, my father was very, very religious. So he was a very evangelical Christian, and he was suddenly diagnosed with cancer 3 years ago, or 3 years ago, and had stage 4. And so I'm not a person of faith, and but I remember watching him and realizing that he needed to believe all the more strongly because he had a fear of dying, so he had to cling to this more. But it's the clinging to it is, so he said, like, this is God's will. Believing that gave him comfort because there was no treatment available for him. So believing, oh, God is calling me home, all this kind of stuff. But I understood what was underlying that is just this incredible fear and heartache. So I think in some ways I say I don't see any possibility of learning how to debate a conspiracy theorist, simply because, you know, it does tend to have that kind of self-sealing quality. But what I do say is that I think it would help us to kind of understand, and this is for us, especially in this country right now, to ask, what is sort of the underlying issue that's motivating people to cling to QAnon or something like that? So better understanding, where's this coming from? I do think it's important that we understand these are not people who have strong political ideologies. That's important to understand. These are people who feel distanced in some way from the political, you know, happenings. So these are not people who
perhaps disenfranchised and
so
separated.
In some ways we have to figure out a way that we can bring those back into what we perceive as society, you know, where they're on the outside. Is how do we make them feel included in the conversation and their voices be heard? I think that's a really good point to end on. What do you say, Lizzie?
Jenny, this has been genuinely fascinating. I could go.
Thank you so
we could go on and on and on, and it's just because our time is up that we can't continue. It's not because we don't want to learn more.
I appreciate it. It's been a great conversation. Thank you.
Where can people learn more about you and your work?
Well, so I do have a very poorly updated Twitter feed. You can just find me at Jenny Rice on Twitter, and I've tried to, you know, be better about posting more serious things. Sometimes not very serious things, but I like engaging with people on that, and so that's one place.
Great.
Awesome.
Well, Jenny, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Guys, I really appreciate it.
We will. Yeah, I'm gonna listen to this back because it's so fascinating. Thank you for listening as well. Brandon, where can people find you?
You can find me at Brandon Ralph everywhere and brandonralph.com. And how about you, Lizzie?
You can find me at lizziehodgson.com and LHDGSN on Twitter. But thank you, everyone. Thank you for this, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks, guys.
A Studio B production.